Okay. Now let's go back to share the screen. Okay. And okay. So as I mentioned downstairs, God speaks. And if you look at the Chinese, I don't know if it's big enough. Can you read it? Let me make it a little bit bigger. All right. Now it's so big. So it starts in Chinese with the word Shen. So it's basically said God spoke. And in the original Greek, it's right here. And it's actually, the main verb is a participle. God was speaking to the fathers and the prophets. And in these last days, he is speaking in his Son. All right. And so that was what I basically said downstairs. Was originally, how did you know when it was God speaking to you? I mean, there are evil spirits, there are ghosts. You hear a voice. How do you know it's the voice of God? So it became a question for how do you determine when God is speaking or when some other kind of spirit is speaking. You just hear a voice. You don't know what it is or what it's from. How can you tell? And what God said in the Old Testament was, I will speak through prophets. So prophets were special people who God gave the gift of prophecy, which means to tell what God says. Right? And then he says, and the way you will know them is because they will be able to do miracles. All right, so Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. What page is Hebrews on? It's in the New Testament, and it's toward the last part of the Bible. So, and of course, this is English order, so last is in the right-hand side. So, in the last 8th or 16th of the Bible, you'll find the book of Hebrews. Hebrews. Huh? 139. Page 139 of the New Testament. 139. Son, Leo. Joe. You get to 1136, you'll be close. Yeah. And the version you have says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. And what does that mean? All right, when was this book written? This book was written around 60 AD. Right? Where is the past for them? Well, the past for them would be in the BC aging. So it's actually between 4000 BC and 2000 BC that these prophets came from God and wrote their messages. Now, how do you know the difference between that kind of prophet and a Confucius kind of writer? And the answer was, God's prophets do miracles. Okay, so what are miracles? All right, can you do miracles? Well, no, I can't do miracles either. How do we know that a person is speaking from God? Well, he does a miracle. What is a miracle? It has to be supernatural. All right? And the most common supernatural miracle was to tell the future, to say this will happen, and it happens. Okay? And as a matter of fact, there's a passage in the Bible that says, if what he says doesn't come true, I didn't send him. So now you say, well, in China, we have fortune tellers. Are they prophets? Well, does what they say come true? I mean, that's how you tell whether somebody who claims to be speaking from God actually is speaking from God. And so he has to tell something that's going to happen in the future, and it has to happen. Then you know that person is from God. But then the time axis is pretty hard to pin down. You could say, well, what you said hasn't come true. And then the prophet would say, well, when it does come true, you'll know that I am sent from God. But on the other hand, if what he says turns out to not happen and the opposite happen, then you know he was not speaking from God. So it's similar to how we know what's true and what's not true. When we study things by means of the scientific method, we think we know the truth. But on the other hand, we actually say there's a CI, a confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. That means there's a 5% chance you're wrong. Right? So science is just probability. This is probably true. And some prophets' words were probably true. How can you tell me that it's not true? And the answer is I have to have a counterexample. So that's why when we do our thesis or our dissertation, we have to start with a falsifiable hypothesis. What does that mean? That means when I write my thesis statement for my paper, it has to be falsifiable. That means it has to be something that can be proved wrong when it runs into a contradiction. That's the problem with logic. It can tell you when things are wrong. It cannot tell you when they're right. So when they're right, you say, okay, there's more and more people who've tested it, more and more people who've tested it, and we think it's right, but we still have a degree of uncertainty or a confidence interval. So science cannot give us certainty. Science can only give us probability. So how can we have certainty? Well, in order for there to be certainty, there must be a God. Those two work together. And when God speaks, that's certainty. But then when a prophet speaks, is that from God or not? That's the question. So when we study the Bible, that's one of the things we're looking for. Is this true? Or is this falsifiable? And the answer is, Well, it stood the test of 4,000 years, and nobody has been able to demonstrate that it's false. So the Bible is as true as any other book, and it is more true than many because they've been falsified over time. But the Bible has not been falsified over 4,000 years of time. So what the verse 1 says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. And what that means is the word. What is a word? A word is a sound that conveys a meaning. And if it's a written language, the sound can be made permanent by writing it down. But if it's just an oral language, it is a sound that you hear and then it goes away. How do you know what you heard? Yeah. It's easy to find out examples. If you get married, you'll find out, you'll say something and your spouse will say, okay, and then a couple of hours later you have forgotten it, or they have forgotten it, or you no longer agree on what you said. That's because it's not right in writing. If you put it in writing, if it's in words and it's permanent, then we can look at what we wrote, what we said we believe. But, you know, it's very common for people to say, you said X, and you say, no, I didn't say X. And that's the problem. What all I can really attest to is I heard X, not that you said X, unless it's in writing. And then if it's in writing, we have a way to say, all right, this is what you said. Yes, that's what I said. It's in writing. Okay. But if we're left to just what we hear, we're not allowed to come to an answer. You said this. No, I didn't. How are you going to know? It's my word against her word. Where do you go? You can't. So when things are written, they are permanentized so that you can go back and look at it. Otherwise, they're just sounds that came into our ears, went into our brains, were somehow processed and stored. But then there's this process of remembering what I heard, and what I heard is not necessarily what was said. So putting things in writing is a very important thing for civilizations. People have to put it in writing so that it becomes permanent and agreed upon. Right? The prophets wrote the words of God. God spoke sounds. They wrote them down. They became permanent. And that's how you and I, 4,000 years later, can read this stuff and know what God said, because of the oral to written language. So, coffee break. Oral to written language. Now, I bet you're wondering, what's the difference between oral and oral? I know nobody's wondering, but I'll write them. There's two words. Oral and oral. Do you know what the difference between oral and oral? This one means I hear. And this one mean I say? I want help with my oral English. I want to know how to say it. I want help with my oral English. I want to learn how to listen. So that oral comes mostly from French, and oral comes mostly from Latin, meaning the mouth. And oral has to do with the ear. But so that we hear oral things, we say oral things, and oral are said almost the same. If you're not a native English speaker, oral and oral sound just alike, right?
Exactly the same for me.
Exactly the same, right? Yeah. And if I put an R or an L in there, oh, I got L's. And there is an R and there's an R and an L in both of them. All right. So yeah, there's no way for a Chinese person to hear that distinction. You were not raised with that, those sounds differentiated in your past. All right. So oral English, I'll point to my ear, is what I hear. Oral English is what I speak. God spoke oral Hebrew. The prophet heard oral Hebrew, and he wrote down, that's a third way of transmitting. Let's see, we call that writing. And the written form is a way to make permanent what the oral said to the oral. And I wrote it. Now it becomes permanent. So how long does oral language last? How long do the sound waves stay so you can hear them? Well, when I'm tuning my ear and I hear myself, that's my echo off the back wall. I can hear my echo coming off the back wall. That was a few milliseconds. The sound lasted for a few milliseconds. Between the time you said it and I heard it, there was a few milliseconds, and immediately my hearing circuits in my brain make neural networks of what I hear. They try to make a permanent, organic network of information. Now, there's the problem of what the words mean. I can hear words and not know what they mean. Just like when I spoke oral to you, you didn't know what they meant until I told you, because you're not language majors. Okay? So language majors know the difference. We don't. Somebody has to tell us in order for us to get the meaning. So this whole conversational thing is really, it's kind of a miracle if we understand each other. All right. Now, one way we can increase the possibility is by putting it into writing. But that does not mean that you understood what I meant. It only means you understood what I heard, and you could reproduce what I said. Okay. But there's the problem of meaning, and that problem is the interpretation. The problem of interpretation, which is a bigger problem than the problem of translation. Suppose I said it in a language and you don't know that language. Then it needs to be translated into your language. And then it still has to be interpreted. What does that mean in the language that I spoke it in, the language it was translated into, and the language It's still got the interpretation problem. So it's always miraculous when you have two people on the same wavelength, two people who can communicate with each other and understand what they're saying. And you should just expect that whenever you have a conversation with somebody, they really don't know what you're saying. You've got to go over it multiple times to make sure that they hear what you said. And then after that, you also need to put it in writing if it's one of those important things. And then hopefully it'll have the same meaning to you that it has to them. But that's the problem with multiple people. If it was just me, I know what I said and I know what it means and I know how to hear it. But if you're involved, then it becomes a very big problem. Because what you understand is based upon your past. What I understand is based upon my past. Let's suppose we use the word go. Now, was I speaking English or Chinese? Go. All right, I will say it in English, dog. Okay, I say dog or I say go. What image in your mind is formed by that word? It is directly related to the first go you ever saw. When you think of a go, you think of your first go. Now, if you had a little Chinese Shih Tzu and I had a German Shepherd, we have different images in our brains that we associate those sounds with. And so when we talk about dog, I will be thinking about my big, strong dog that will protect me. And you'll think about this little bitty dog who will bark. And so even though we use the same word and we have similar images, they're different. So what it means to me and what it means to you is still an interpretation problem. And every interpretation problem is ultimately a personal problem. I have my interpretation, you have your interpretation, and mine is related to my history. And unfortunately, no two people have the same history, even if they're twins. You know, one of them has a right-handed history and the other has a left-handed history, a right-handed understanding and a left-handed understanding. Their point of view is going to be a little different from each other. So it's a problem. Language is an awesome problem. We don't know what they mean. They don't know what we mean. But still, we've got to get by. We still have to live together and eat together and meet together and study together and do the things we do. But how can you do it in light of all this complexity of we don't understand? All right, same way you learn English, same way you learn Chinese. Repetition, over and over and over. You get the same sound and the same meaning, and you start learning it. Okay. And so in a relationship, we have to repeat things over and over and over in order to, does she know what I said? I mean, does she really know? Zheng De really know what I said? And, you know, no. Don't expect that that person will ever know what you said and what you meant, but think that it's good enough. It's like the mathematical problem. All right, this is a sofa. All right, that looks like a sofa more or less. What is a sofa? Sofa. Okay, so, and here is a guy sitting here, and here is the girl. Make it different colored. She's got more hair. That's how we know the difference. There's the girl sitting there. All right, now the father comes in and says to the guy, don't get any closer to my daughter than halfway. Guy says, okay. Well, what's halfway? There's the halfway mark. So the guy says, okay, I can move over to here. I'm halfway there. And then he tries to use the formula reiteratively. What does that mean? Reiteratively means to do it again. It's in a loop, okay? So he says, oh, I can go halfway. So he goes halfway again. And then he says, oh, I can go halfway. And he goes halfway again. Now, do you see that mathematics will tell you he will never get there? If I only get halfway, I will never get there. But he gets close enough for practical purposes. What does that mean? Well, if my halfway gets into the millimeter range, I'm close enough. I can smell her, I can almost feel her. It's close enough. I can whisper in her ear. Practical purposes. So even though theoretically, if I go halfway, I've always got another halfway I can have. But for practical purposes, when I'm in a millimeter range, I'm close enough. All right. So that means that language is that kind of thing. We will never have complete uniformity of understanding. But if we keep on trying and keep on repeating, we'll be close enough for practical purposes. We'll begin understanding each other well enough to keep going, keep talking, and keep being related. All right. Now, what's this got to do? Well, this is how God communicates with us. He uses words. Those words are in some spoken language. The prophet heard them, God said them, the prophet wrote them down. Right? Because they're in writing, we can know what God said. What does it mean? There's a whole science called the interpretation or hermeneutics. How do you understand the writings of the Bible? Okay, and so we have these biblical scientists that will study the words in Hebrew or the words in Greek and what they meant, but they're spoken in a context. 4,000 years ago, things are different than they are today. So what do they mean today, and what did they mean 4,000 years ago? That's a scientific job that the hermeneuticist or the interpretation person can do when he's going from Hebrew to Chinese or Hebrew to English. And so this verse is telling us God spoke at many times and in various ways in the past. But can we understand what he said? And the answer is Yes. Why do I think the answer is yes? Because there's a common meaning and a common understanding. All right, there is a Putonghua. All right, so that we can have a common language, and we both learn Putonghua, even though one of us might have been in the north and one of us might have been in the south in China, and we really speak different dialects, but yet we both learned Putonghua, so we can get together and talk and mostly understand each other. Okay, it's like Tai Tai Shuo Cantonghua. So sometimes she can talk to a person from Hong Kong and she can understand Cantonese, but she can also speak in Taiwanese, and the Canton person don't know. All right, so they then need to go to Mandarin so that they both have an understanding. Now, it might not be a correct understanding. That's always a problem when there's two people. I might not really understand you. And whenever I teach, the people might not really understand me. That's okay. So what do you do when you know that you're in this fluid framework of having to use language that may or may not be understood outside of my family? Well, you try to get everybody on the same wavelength. You try to get everybody to go to the government school. Everybody learns the same thing. We learn the same framework. We learn the same way of looking at things. Unfortunately, as we grow up, as we go to college, we leave our hometown and we get faced with other people and other societies, other habits, other ways of doing things. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, 认的什么? What's real? What is right? What's I'm having a cultural conflict between what I was taught in my hometown and what I'm taught in Mississippi. So what do? Well, if you understand that there's an interpretation problem before I get to the meaning and understanding of somebody, then you'll be patient. You'll say, what are they saying? What does it mean? All right, same way, Hebrews chapter 1 is telling us, God spoke to our ancestors, a different generation, a different location, and different ways in various times. And we know at least 3 languages were used in writing the original books. There was Hebrew, there was Aramaic, and there was Greek. All right, now, y'all can say, I don't know any one of those 3 languages. How do I know what God said? And the answer is, well, right here, I've got the Chinese translation right here in the middle. I've also got the Greek original language, and I've got English to help me through a different way of understanding things. And as a matter of fact, there's multiple Chinese versions. This is called the Chinese Union Simplified version. We can also, on this app, we can go, wow, look at that. All of the Zhongguo, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different Chinese language versions of the Bible. Let's see. Let me look at the CCB. What does that one say? It's called the Hello. Chinese Contemporary Bible, Simplified. All right. So that notice that it doesn't start with the word shun the way the CUVS did. It starts with the word Sai, which means in the past. I think it's Shangdi, God. It uses a different word from God than the other one used. The other ones use Shin. Right? So now I have another version in Chinese that will help me understand. And what is my goal when I look at the Bible? My goal is, what did God say to that prophet, and what does that mean to me? So I will use many versions to help me, because if God speaks to people, I want to know what he said. Will he speak to me? And why do we gather on Friday nights and study the Bible? Why do we have church on Sundays and the preacher preaches the Bible? Because it's a very important thing. God spoke to people. All right. So now we're ready to go to verse 2, which says, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. All right. Now, what means the last days? Somebody, what's the last days? To us, we think of the last days as something in the future. But the writer said these last days. So the writer thought that he was in the last days. So the last days began in the 1st century AD, when people, were ruled by the Roman Empire. They had, the Putonghua was Greek. Everybody knew Greek. And so that's why this text is written in Greek, because it was written in the 1st century. And everybody knew Greek in that century, because Alexander the Great had conquered the whole, what we now know as the Western world, but not Megwo, all of Europe and the Mediterranean area and Africa, all of that had been conquered by Alexander the Great, and he was Greek, and he gave his language and his culture to the known world. And then the Romans came in and defeated him, and they gave their roads, their transportation system to the known world. And that all happened right here in the 1st century when this was written, which means that the time was perfect. There was a common language and a common transportation system, that when Jesus came, he told his disciples, go into all the world and teach. Well, now the world had one language, the Greek language they could use, and one transportation system, either the ships or the Roman roads. And the disciples could go to the whole world at that time. So the time was perfect when he came in the 1st century. All right. But verse 2 says, in these last days. The last days were in the 1st century. Now, if they were in the 1st century and I'm still alive, I'm living in the last days. And the last days had their beginning in the 1st century. Okay, so we're living in the last days. And in the last days, God spoke to us by his Son. All right, so now we need to know, who is the Son of God? All right, and if you heard the songs we sang tonight, Yehovah, all right, and we call him Jesus. Jesus is the Hebrew name, and the Greek name is Jehovah. I mean, the Hebrew name. The Hebrew name Jehovah, and the Greek name, Jesus, Yeshua. And what Yeshua means is Jehovah saves. Jesus was given the name Jehovah saves, which in Latin, coming from the Greek, is Jesus. All right. So that name means Jehovah, the God name of the Old Testament is the Savior. Right. So it says, in these last days, he spoke to us by his Son, whom we call Jesus. And it says, he, meaning God, appointed Jesus the heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. Wow. All right, this writer is telling us there is a person in the first century who was the Son of God, who is the heir, H-E-I-R. What does that word mean? The heir. He's the descendant. He's the one who receives the inheritance. Right? He is the heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. It says, in the first century, God spoke through his Son, and his Son is the one through whom he made the universe. Now, not one of you was in this class when we studied the book of John. So let's look at those first few words. John chapter 1, verse 1. All right. John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. All right, and let's just bring up the Chinese as well, because it's interesting to see that the word is used in the Chinese Bible as This is not the CUVS. This is the CCB. Let's translate this. That ought to be good. Control C. You guys know Chinese, but I don't, so I have to use translate. Wow. Hello. TR. All right, Google Translate. And for Google Translate, what do I get when I try to translate this sentence? Speed up, thank you. All right, look at the word Tao. There it is. In the beginning, the Tao, or Tao in Chinese, already exists. And Tao, look, Tao, that's 就是上帝. Okay. So that says that the Word was God. And why did it use the word Tao instead of some other word for word? Because in the Greek version, it was actually, I don't have the Greek up here, it's actually logos. And Logos is more than word. It's sometimes translated word, but it's also the root of the word for logical, for something. All right. So here you see that what is logos, logos in Greek, was Tao in Chinese, which was translated as word in English. And so it's not like a word. It's like the word. It is a logical concept. So that the word Tao is a good translation of what logos means in Chinese. It's a way. Okay. So and it's not necessarily related to the Chinese philosophy Taoism, but it is similar. I mean, the use of the word is it's talking about a way. So in the beginning was the word, was the way to know God, and we're going to find, if we look down at verse 14, that he was actually talking about a human. In verse 14, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. How would you say that in Chinese? Verse 14. Wow. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. Let me copy it. Verse 14, let's go to translate. What would we do without the tools? I don't know. The Chinese people can't use these tools. Google is not allowed. Okay. Dao Cheng Wei Rou Shen. All right. So it says the Dao, the way became human, meat, flesh. The word became flesh, which means it became a human, became a person. And it was full of grace and truth, and we saw it. So what this book of John is telling us is that Tao became flesh, and that Tao was in the beginning when God created everything. The Tao was there. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Right? And then you go back to Hebrews, not Deuteronomy, Hebrews, and it says, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. So this is just a reference to this Tao who made the universe, who was with God in the beginning. So Jesus pre-existed before humanity was made. And of course, when you look at Genesis 1, it says, let us make man in our image. What is the image of God? Why, it's Jesus. So Adam was made to look like Jesus. He was made to look like a human. And so you know, this all combines to give us a story. And what the author of Hebrews is telling us, the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purifications for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. So the focus of this author of Hebrews in writing this letter to us is to let us know that God spoke in the past through the prophets in these words that we need to have interpreted and understood. But now in that first century, he spoke through a person. And so now we can look at the life of that person and know what God is like and know who God is. So the person of Jesus becomes the focus of this book. Jesus tells us all we need to know about God. And so this author of this book is telling us, if you want to know God, you need to know Jesus. Now, if we get back to the question I asked downstairs when I tried to speak my best Chinese, and I said, ramen, that's us, we, and then I said, Zimma, all right. And then I said, Nung, and then I said, what was that word? Shangdi, right? How do we know God? And the answer is we know God by knowing Jesus. So that we find, how do we know Jesus? And the answer comes from in the Bible. So we study the Bible in order to know Jesus. We study Jesus in order to know God. And that's what we're learning about in this book, the book of Hebrews, that Jesus is the exact image of God. He's the radiance of God's glory, and he is sustaining all things by his powerful word. That means that what we think is reality is only there because Jesus is holding it together. Jesus is sustaining everything there is by his powerful word. All right, what does Chinese use for that word in verse 3? Wow, that's too much information. Gao Shang Di De something something. I need to know what that is. We'll look that up real quick. Whoa, how did I do that? I don't know, but I'll figure it out. Let's just go back up here. Ooh. All right, that's where I wanted to go. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the end of verse 3. Through him on, oh, that's John. I wanted to be in Hebrews. There I go. Verse 3. Let me do the whole verse so I can figure out what I'm doing. Then go back to translate. Then go back to put in the verse. He is the glory of God's glory, the true image of God's body, maintains everything by his own words of power. Words of power. All right. So that should be, Ta Yong Zi Ji Chang Man, Neng Li De Hua Yu Wei Ji Wan Wu. Okay. So where it says Hua Yu, Hua Yu, that's his words. Okay. And so the that's where that phrase in John 1:1, the word Hua Yu is actually translated Dao. Instead of putting it in Chinese as the word, it wants you to know it's bigger than word. It's the way, right? And so, but then it says, how did we know what the way is? And the answer is by his word, by his Hua Yu. What's Wan Wu? Hua Yu Wen Si Wan Wu. I'm going to Gao Shan Di De. What's this phrase? Yeah, what's that mean?
Right side.
Okay, sitting at the right hand of God. I remember that. All right. And then what is Tian Shang? Something Gao Shang. And then that's Di De. Wow. Anyway, so God, Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, doing everything. He's holding everything together. All right. After he cleansed the sin of the world, he sat on the right hand of God in heaven. There, it's more clear. He maintains everything with his own words of power. That's what I was looking for. He maintains everything by his own words of power. Something like that. Okay. So we're at the 8:30 mark, which means it's time to ask Neo Wantima. Do you have any questions? I know you've got some questions. Can you ask them? 你可以问你的问题吗？
I ask a question. The Bible is right. Use which language to write the Bible?
All right. The Bible that you hold in your hand is actually 66 books put into one volume that we call the Bible. Those 66 books, maybe 44 of them were written in Hebrew and 3 of them in Aramaic. So that's the Old Testament. And then the other 39 were written in Greek. That's the New Testament. So the Greek was written in the 1st century, and the Hebrew and Aramaic were written in the 4,000 years prior to the 1st century. So the whole book for us is at least 4,000 years old today, and perhaps 6,000 years, depending upon your understanding of history and linguistics and so forth. If you think about the Chinese calendar, okay, when does the Chinese calendar start? It's about 6,000 years ago. Right? When did the United States calendar, the Gregorian and who's that other Roman guy? The Gregorian calendar and there's one of the Caesars, Julian calendar. They're the ones the Western world uses. But the Eastern world goes back about 6,000 years. The Bible has history that goes back in it about 6,000 years. So that Bible history and Chinese history kind of correspond. And so, what I say is world history also corresponds to that. It's about 6,000 years, 6 to 10,000 years. Now, as a trained geologist, I can tell you there's nothing in geological records that would contradict that this world, this universe is probably between 6 and 10,000 years. Then the literary calendar world also supports that. So, it's only somebody who believes in Darwinian evolution that would want to contradict that. Because he needs lots and lots and lots of time for his evolution to occur. and there wasn't that much time, according to the histories of all the people groups who kept histories. So it's interesting. Hanyo Isi. Okay. Any other question? No more question. Yeah, question. I got a question. Why can't we leave now? Okay. Yes, we can leave, but let me pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We pray that you would help us to be those people whom you've opened our hearts to understand, opened our ears to hear, opened our eyes to see who you are and how you revealed yourself through this word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for your explanation.
Explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Bible terms, we use a word called gift. I have a gift from God to teach the Bible and teach anything really. So I have a gift to teach, and I'm